Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig Lyndall, joined as always by Andrew Schnitkey. How is it going, Andrew?
It is quite warm in my house. I have this arbitrary rule that I don't turn my AC on until Memorial Day, and these last couple days are really testing the limits of that. It's too hot in here, and I got a bright light shining on me, and yeah, I don't know. I might give in today. I'm not sure, but other
I
than
don't
that,
live by any of those fake rules. I do what
it's
I
so
want.
dumb. It's so arbitrary. There's no reason for it. I do it every year. I try to make it to Memorial Day. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to give in here after this podcast, probably.
So, you and I are very excited for this podcast. We decided it's the 30th anniversary of 1994. And 1994, I think, objectively goes down as one of the strongest years for music in the history of rock music. Um, and I know that there are other types of music other than rock music, but in terms of alternative rock, kind of that tail end of grunge into the post-grunge, alternative radio was at its peak. MTV was at its peak, and it's just widely recognized as this phenomenal year. And you and I are going to do a fantasy draft of our top 5 records.
I think you hit it on the head that what makes '94 such an interesting year is because you have I guess you would call it the tail end of grunge. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it was the start of the end of the tail end. You had sort of, that was happening, but then you sort of had the rise of some mainstream metal that was coming into play. Some sort of indie stuff was coming up. Punk had some good stuff that year. Like, it was just this weird confluence of these genres of rock music that all kind of hit at the same time, and a lot of really seminal bands in all of these different genres put out albums in '94.
So we won't go through. You were nice enough to put together kind of the big board, Mel Kiper's
So,
big
well,
board of 94 albums.
I would say I treated this like an NFL draft. So we start with the combine. Before I even make my big board, we have to have the combine. So I had to pick which football players we wanted to invite to the combine. And so I just went through a list of 9 albums that came out in '94 and pulled out the ones that I thought like were worthy enough of being even considered. And I came up with a list of 51 albums that came out in 1994 that I think are worth mentioning in some degree. Now, I
So
don't
I know
love
you're
all
not
of
going to
them.
read every single one of them, but give people a sampling.
Yeah, let me so I'll talk about some, although this is kind of giving you
No,
a
just
hint of some stuff
go.
I'm not
Don't
going to
hint at all.
pick.
Start anyone on the list.
But just like some random ones, you had like Smashing Pumpkins put out Pisces Iscariot that year. Collective Soul's first album, Hints, Allegations, and Things Left Unsaid. Hootie and the Blowfish, Cracked Rearview Mirror came out that year. Dave Matthews Band, Under the Table and Dreaming. Jeff Buckley put out Grace, which is a huge album. Korn, they had their first album came out that year.
Which is crazy, by the way, to think that like the first Korn record came out at the tail end of grunge, because there's such a late '90s band in
Yeah,
all of our minds, I think. But
yeah,
no, they really started before the middle of that decade.
yeah. We had the Brit pop wave was coming in with Blur. Park Life came out that year. If you're into hip hop, Nas put out Illmatic, which a lot of people think is one of the all time greatest rap albums ever. Sonic Youth put out an album. Dinosaur Jr. put out an album that year. 311 put out Grassroots, Rancid, Let's Go. So like just all these different bands like put out
Not to
albums.
mention Nine Inch Nails, Stone Temple Pilots, Alice in Chains, Blues Traveler, Weezer.
Yeah.
REM was still hanging around with Monster.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty crazy. So kind of whatever you were into, something came out that year, and Garth Brooks' Greatest Hits also came
And
out.
so
The hits.
and so what we're going to do is we're going to do a coin toss to see who gets to go first, and then you and I are we're not going to crown the greatest top five. We're going to do the personal top five.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I suggested and you agreed that we ought to just take Pearl Jam Vitalogy off the board, and we'll talk about
Yep.
it first because I don't know if it would it have been your number one pick if you gotten to go first.
Yes, it would have been. It actually was there. There's a couple albums that I put right up there with it, but I mean, anybody who's been watching this knows how we feel about Pearl Jam. Vitalogy
Sure.
is one of their absolute essential core albums. It was such a cool album. Like I remember getting that winter. It came out in the winter, so it must have been the towards the end of '94 that came out. I don't
I'll look
remember
it
the
up, but
month. Was it like I think it was like
before you get
October?
into it, would it be your number one pick if you were trying to pick the strongest universal slate?
No,
Or okay,
no. There's something else I would pick that I think
then we'll get
probably
into
got.
that later.
But yeah, but no, I like Vitalogy was such a cool album because it was coming off of I think we talked a little bit about how important Versus was when we did our sophomore albums episode. That was a really important album for Pearl Jam, and then it was kind of like, well, where do they go from there? After 10 came out in '91 versus '92, then there was this break to '94, and so it was the first time an album didn't just come out like immediately. There was like a little bit of breathing room for a Pearl Jam
So
album.
you're a little bit off. Versus came out in October of '93.
Oh, so it was actually a quick turnaround.
Vitalogy came out in November of '94. It came out November 22nd. The Spin the Black Circle Tremor Christ
Yeah.
single was released on November 8th.
It's what's funny about that is like time works differently when you're a kid, so like I being in high school, in my mind it felt like there was a big gap between Versus and Vitalogy, but it was actually their shortest gap between albums.
And in my mind, Vitalogy feels like a '95 record.
Yeah, because it came out so late. And also I'm pretty sure that that release date is for vinyl because it came out on vinyl first. They actually released that on vinyl before CD. I remember that as well because I knew it was out, but I couldn't listen to it because I didn't have a record player. So I had to wait for the CD. That's right. So yeah, for me, I don't know. Vitalogy it's just it's one of the more eclectic Pearl Jam albums. And it gave us Better Man and Corduroy, like the Not For You, which are just essential Pearl Jam songs, ones you're going to hear all the time if you see them live. They still play. Maybe not For You, not as much, but definitely play Better Man and Corduroy all the time.
The other really confusing thing about the release of this record, and I just had to look it up, so I'm not like an encyclopedia, but they played Not For You on Saturday Night Live in April of '94.
Yeah.
So
I miss those days. When Pearl Jam used to do that all the time. They used to play songs live before they were on the album. Like I remember Lukin. It was a song on the bootlegs. It was always called, I think it was called the 100 Pacer or something like that. It was a song that they would always just like play as like an interlude in their live sets before they put it on record.
When I remember having that episode of Saturday Night Live recorded off of TV and watching it over and over and over on my VHS tape. So it was weird to have a song that early from a record that wasn't coming out for another 7 months. And in those days, there was no internet. I didn't know when that record was coming out. It was like, I would have to go ask the guy at the record store, my local record store.
You'd wait for the posters or the signs that they would put up of releases. Yeah.
So obviously, Vitalogy is a huge record for both of us personally. We took it off the board. And we could spend more time talking about it, but I feel like we already have.
Yeah. Yeah. So
you want to do the coin toss?
Let's get to the coin toss here.
I choose heads.
I've got a coin flip app here on my computer, and so you called heads.
Well, if you did it on your phone, you could show it to the camera.
Yeah, I don't want to do that because I want the opportunity to lie and say I got the first pick. So we'll flip. It's actually heads. So,
all right,
you've got the first pick. You are on the clock.
I actually feel like this is more pressure It would have been easier to go second just to see where you were going to go, because I don't think there are any wrong answers per se. I'm nervous making the first pick that you're going to pick my second pick, which it might actually be more important to me in a lot of ways. My first pick is going to be The Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails. Um, I can't remember if we've talked about this one on the podcast before, but like this record came out and I'd already been in on Nine Inch Nails. I listened to their first record and I was just I had the tape actually. It was one of the first CDs I bought that replaced a tape. This and 10 by Pearl Jam. But Nine Inch Nails then released Broken, and I was just infatuated with this super dangerous, mysterious band. Mm-hmm. And The Downward Spiral only added to it, because that was probably the most dangerous record I'd ever listened to up to that moment in time.
Yeah.
Trent Reznor was this figure that everybody was infatuated with. I said previously in something I wrote about this record that like the girls thought he was the sexiest man alive, and the boys just wanted to be him. Like he was that rock star for me at age 15 when The Downward Spiral came out. And I was almost confused that the girls would be attracted. The girls that I went to high school with would be attracted to this kind of weird looking loner figure. Right. And that was the first time I realized like that, sex appeal was a little bit different for teenagers.
Yeah, that I agree with all of that. I would say Downward Spiral, definitely not my favorite Nine Inch Nails album, but there's no question the impact it had when that came out in 1994. Certainly on people our age. So I agree with all that. I will say this would not have been my number one pick, or
okay,
had I won the coin toss though. So we'll see if my second pick is stealing from, or my first pick is stealing from you or not. But my first pick, the second pick overall in our 1994 draft, is Soundgarden, Super Unknown. And I could make this easy and say, just go listen to our episode. We did a full episode breaking down everything about this album. We really deconstructed it. So I've said a lot about it already on this podcast. I'll just say, Soundgarden has been my second favorite band of all time, pretty much my entire life. And again, Super Unknown, not my favorite Soundgarden album. That would be Down on the Upside. But when Super Unknown came out, this was the album that made us really confident of what Soundgarden could be, because Soundgarden was still, even though they had been around longer than any of the other Seattle bands, they really by 94 they had only had Bad Motorfinger as what I would say was on most people's radar. Ultra Mega OK was a major label release, but it didn't sell like crazy. And their previous albums hadn't really sold to the masses, if you will. They were definitely an underground band at that point. And Super Unknown is the album that made Soundgarden into an absolute force and a powerhouse. And I talked about this in our episode. This was the album that kind of made them at that time the biggest Seattle band, because Pearl Jam, after Vitalogy, pretty much withdrew from the public completely.
By choice.
That was by choice. That was when they stopped doing just about anything. I mean, they were still touring, but they weren't doing interviews, they weren't doing videos. They had really disappeared from the public consciousness, and Soundgarden kind of took those reins. It was kind of their time to shine. So Super Unknown's a super important album to me for that reason. So for me, this was, take Vitalogy off the board, this had to be my next pick.
Well, and the interesting thing too is that Soundgarden didn't have that. Bad Motorfinger didn't do for them what 10 did or what Nevermind did. So they needed the breakout record that would put them in the spotlight. But it was probably kind of good for them to go second or third or fourth. I can't remember if Dirt came out.
Dirt was already out. Dirt was like 92. Yeah, because Jar of Flies came out in 94, so Dirt was definitely already out.
So in the weirdest way, one of the older bands was actually third or fourth
That's
uh,
right.
thought of.
I would say they
And
were prior to Super Unknown. I would say they were thought of as fourth on that pecking list. It was Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and then it was like, yeah, Soundgarden, the Bad Motor Finger's pretty cool. Is
I'm
how a
trying to
lot of
think if
people.
there was a time where I would have put Screaming Trees ahead of Soundgarden personally, like in my youth and
Yeah,
innocence.
yeah. Well, I mean, Screaming Trees were a little bit more similar to those. Like Soundgarden is so different from the other Seattle bands. While they are, if we're going to use grunge as a term, they're unquestionably a grunge band. But the things
Mhm.
they were doing with the time signatures and the weird riffs, just they were not like the other Seattle bands in that way. They were definitely the most out there in terms of how they wrote their songs.
Which is something that you and I talked about in that long episode is like Felon Black Days. They keep moving the one. Like it's not a
Yep.
straight 4/4 time signature.
Yeah.
Um it sounds normal to fans, but if you are any type of musician and you try and play along to it and you're for my friends who play metal and play polyrhythms and stuff, they're like, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I totally get it." But you've got to be advanced to the 201 or the 301 level as a musician to understand what Soundgarden's doing.
Yeah. Whenever I play that on guitar, like the transition from the verse into the little pre-chorus part is always like a little confusing because you're not quite sure where that rhythm changes. And that's just because it's a song that, you're right, it sounds normal, but it's a weird song.
All right. So I guess this means I got to go for my second pick, right?
Yep.
I think that this one might, I mean, it's personal, so it's not controversial, but I think it will be viewed as controversial by anybody who would like to imagine themselves in my shoes making these picks. In a weird way, I think this is recency bias because I recently dove deep into this record and wrote
I
about
already
it.
know what it is.
I'm sure you do. Um, I spent so much time with this record and kind of I always loved it, but I rediscovered the greatness of it and maybe discovered a level of greatness to it recently that I hadn't even realized in the moment, and that's Stone Temple Pilots Purple. Um, there I won't spoil it because I think there are a lot of other records that people would pick before Purple, but I think if you really spent a week or two the way I did recently listening to every single song on that over and over and over again like it's brand new, um, we've almost taken it for granted and underrated it as a complete work. It is one of the most complete records from this entire era. The hits are huge. It's got the hugest hit of Stone Temple Pilots' career. Um, Kitchenware and Candy Bar is like a total afterthought. It's maybe my favorite Stone Temple Pilots song of all time. Um, and the gravity of Weiland's death much later, revisiting it makes it feel so big. So that's my pick is Purple. So is that what you thought?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
And yeah, I liked Core when it came out. I liked it. I wasn't blown away by them as a band, but it was a good album. I thought Cracker Man was especially awesome on it. But I remember, I think was Vaseline the first single? Because
I do believe.
I feel like I remember that being the first song I heard. And again, you want to talk
Well,
about a
except the
song?
one from the Crow soundtrack, Big Empty,
Oh, well, yeah, right.
but
But
that doesn't really count.
I remember, like, that's another one that you talk about a song that sounds normal. But I played bass in a band in high school, and trying to figure out and understand some of Rob DeLeo's bass parts on that album was just mind blowing to me. And like even Vaseline, which is a fairly straightforward bass part, but the timing is just ever so slightly off that I would
And
keep
the
getting confused.
syncopation.
Yeah, the syncopation. That's what I was going for. The syncopation of that just kind of would throw me off trying to play that and keep in time with them on that song. But yeah, that's a great album. That's my favorite STP album for sure. It's really not even close for me. So yeah.
So in hindsight, it's not close for me either, but I will constantly bring up the fact that I once upon a time wrongly tried to tell you that I thought Tiny Music was my favorite Stone Temple Pilots
Yeah.
record. And I do love that record, but there's no way it
Mm-mm.
compares to Purple. No way.
Nope. There's nothing as stupid as Art School Girlfriend on Purple.
No.
So
No, but like Adhesive and the trumpets,
yeah.
some of the stuff that they were doing on that record, if Weiland had maintained some level of sobriety or whatever he sanity,
Yeah.
and they had continued to make lots and lots and lots of records, I think, they had as much potential as any band in the world. It's just
Yeah.
such a shame that it ended the way it did.
Yep. So, all right. So I am on the clock here. And here's where I'm debating whether I want to cheat. Um, because, I know you so well. I know which ones of mine you're not going to pick. And I know
Right?
which ones you conceivably could pick. Um, so I'm debating going out of order here. And I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to be a jerk and take this one just because I want this one on my team. And I'm pretty sure I can get my next pick after this. So I'm going to go with Nirvana, MTV Unplugged in New York.
I'm actually happy you picked that one.
Okay. So, this if I was picking this like for what the masses preferred, this might have been my first overall pick.
It absolutely would have been my first
you,
pick if
you
I was
know,
going for the mass appeal.
yep. This album was so monstrously huge. Not, I think we've maybe talked about this a little bit in the past. Like, not only is it like the closing chapter of the Nirvana story, but it just showed depth to Nirvana that you just hadn't seen before. We talked about this a little bit about the genius of Kurt Cobain, but how he can write songs that other people can't write, but he also you know didn't know anything about music theory. And like what this album, when you stripped everything down, you really saw the core of the beauty of the way he wrote songs and the way he would just interlace his guitar playing with his vocal melodies. I adore this album. And so there was a risk that you might have taken this, certainly more so than what my next two are on my list. So I wanted to grab this one.
Well, and on top of it, I mean, what this record did was it took some of the songs from in utero, like it took Penny Royalty and it gave us the definitive version.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I love the version of Penny Royalty from In Utero. It's great, but this is the version. It
I
gave us
feel
the version of All
I
Apologies.
was gonna say I feel the same way about All Apologies.
And honestly, it gave us the version of Something in the Way from
Mm-hmm.
Nevermind too.
Yep.
And then on top of it, it showed us, I don't know if you want to call it an interpretation or it's not an interpolation, I guess, but the way that he covered songs and made them his own, it's such a shame we never got to see him do that. I
Yes.
mean, his version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night redefined that song in the same way that what's his name,
Johnny Cash.
Jeff Buckley.
Oh, Jeff. Oh,
Jeff
great.
Buckley.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Yeah. I was going to talk about that. Well, I was going to say the same thing about the way Johnny Cash kind of made Hurt. He kind of co-opted that, and that like
He did.
that became his song.
Even though I think it's a worse version,
but there's no
he
question. Yeah, and even though I had already heard, so Mark Lanigan has a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night on, I think it's on The Winding Sheet, which is his first solo album. I think I'd have to double check that, but I had heard that version of it, so I was familiar with the song. But like that is Kurt's song. He took the Meat Puppets, Lake of Fire. Or not Lake of, or is it Lake of Fire? What's that song? Oh my gosh.
Plateau, Oh Me, Lake of Fire.
Lake of Fire. I was
Yep.
confusing with Ring of Fire is what I was confusing with. But he took Lake of Fire and turned that into his version. I think he did it with the Bowie song too.
The Man Who Sold the World.
Man Who Sold the World. Like
Bowie fans would disagree with you.
I know they would, but just like we as Nine Inch Nails fans might disagree about the Hurt thing, but
the Vaseline's Jesus Don't Want Me for a Sunbeam, he put that song on the map. It's his song.
Yep, for sure. Yep. And so that's just, I don't know, it's such a cool album to hear what Nirvana was capable of. And again, you just talk about, man, what a shame we didn't, for all the things that Kurt was unhappy about. It's like, man, you could have just gone in an entirely different direction with your music and you guys would have been fine. But
yeah. So with my next pick, I'm going to do something unorthodox. I'm going to make the pick, and then I'm going to let you talk about it first, because I actually think you'll be better about talking about it than I will. And then I will pipe in after you. I pick Jar of Flies by Alice in Chains.
Okay. So this was an interesting one.
Sorry to put you on the spot, buddy.
No, it's fine to be on the spot, but I didn't even put this one on my big board. And it was only because of the slightest of technicality. There's so many good albums here to pick from. And I was like, well, since I need to eliminate stuff, I'm just going to say it's an EP, and so I won't do it. But I'm more than happy to talk about it because I freaking love Jar of Flies. And again, this wasn't totally novel for Alice in Chains. They had already done this between Facelift and Dirt. They put out the Sap EP. And so we had heard this side of Alice in Chains, this more stripped down side. But Jar of Flies took what they did on Sap and just put it on steroids. The arrangements on these, the freaking vocal harmonies, like I stay away. Like it's one of the most confusing songs to sing along with, because you find yourself bouncing between the two melodies, because it's like, well, wait, which part do I even want to sing here? Am I singing Jerry's part or am I singing Lane's part? And so it creates this like thing where you're almost like, at times you're like, wait, I can't even find the right note here because of the way their harmonies played off of each other. You've got the Rotten Apple into Nutshell is just, you can't have a more perfect way to open up an album than those two songs. And then even like No Excuses was a huge radio song, and like that's a
one of the
song.
Coolest drum beats from the entire era.
It's iconic.
Just all the little ghost notes on the hi-hat, the little flares, and just a phenomenal drum beat.
Yeah. And then Don't Follow, it's just a gorgeous song too. It's so powerful when that kicks in at the end, and when Lane goes into that high register, just belting out that last chorus. Like it's
totally different, but it's almost like when Axl goes at the end of Patience.
Yes. No, but that's just, yes, like, that's
it melts your soul.
Yep. You just hit that extra drive, and it's just, so this was just such a powerful album that again just shows what a brilliant songwriter Jerry Cantrell is, the power of the vocal harmonies between him and Lane. Like you mentioned, Sean's drumming is excellent on it. Mike Inez's bass playing is stellar on it. Like, this is just such a masterpiece. And like, I almost wish it was, I almost wish they would have just thrown a couple more songs together for it and made it an actual album. Like, I treat it as an album. Like,
me too.
It's technically an EP, but for me, it feels like an album. And God, I just love this one.
Well, and on top of it all, arguably, it produced the greatest Alice in Chains song, Nutshell, which wasn't even a single. And yeah, I'm sure some people would say Rooster is the greatest one. There's some other candidates, but you'd be hard pressed to make an argument that Nutshell shouldn't be in consideration for greatest Alice in Chains song. Now that the original lineup is gone, So yeah, I couldn't leave this one off. I thought for sure. I'm not surprised that you treat it like an EP because it's a total cop out on your part.
Yep.
Um,
And but I'm a stickler for these kind of stupid. Again, we
you
talk about
are.
arbitrary rules, but I'm a stickler for these kind of things.
I like your air conditioning. You're a
So
purist, and I'm
that's
not.
that's right. So we talked about this a little bit too. Even talking about like closing songs on albums, like with going back to Vitalogy, like is Immortality or is Foxy Mop the last song? And you say it's Immortality, but I'm like, no,
I do.
it's in the track list. Foxy Mop is the last track. So sorry to Immortality. It can't be in consideration.
Well, you're wrong, but you're up. Go ahead.
All right, it's my turn. All right, so I'm gonna get back on track, and I'm gonna pick my true ones for these. Like, this is so hard. Like, I was just looking at this list, and there's so many things I want to talk about. That I
We'll
want to
have
be in my
time.
top five. So we'll do our undrafted rookie free agents after the draft. We'll each sign a couple undrafted rookie free agents. But so I'm going to go with this pick. This is my true pick. This was number 2 on my big board, one of the most important albums of my life. It's something I listen to, God, at least once a month still to this day, probably. And that's Oasis, definitely, maybe. I mentioned
Oh,
this.
I would have picked something else.
I mentioned this that the Britpop or wave coming in. I mentioned that Blur put out Park Life that year, and Oasis putting out Definitely Maybe, and it started that whole Oasis versus Blur rivalry. Now, Definitely Maybe was not a big song in the States, or I mean, a big album in the States. They actually really didn't get super popular in the States until Wonderwall and What's the Story, Morning Glory. That was really their introduction to the US. But I mistakenly bought this album because I thought that, I don't want to say what it is because I don't want any possibility of you stealing this album. Yeah, I'm going to wait and talk about that part of it
Just do it.
later.
There's no way I'm going to pick. My next pick is definitely not on your list.
Okay, well, so I thought that Toadie's Possum Kingdom, I heard it on the radio and I loved that song. And I remember they, on the radio, they back in the day, you'd listen to a block of songs and then the DJ would tell you what those songs were. And he had thrown in there Oasis Supersonic. Well, I mistook the order of how many songs we were behind. So I thought that Possum Kingdom was Oasis. So I went out and bought this Oasis album. And I'm, skipping through the tracks trying to get to Possum Kingdom, like this just does not sound like that same band. Like what's going on here? And I was pissed at first. It was one of those things. It's like, man, this is not what I meant to buy. And, we've talked about this, like, I'm a 14-year-old kid. Like, I don't have a lot of money. CDs are expensive. Like, it's an important decision when you decide to buy an album,
$16 to you then is like $2,500 today.
Yeah, I mean, it was brutal. I was swindled, So, but all right. Well, I guess I better at least listen to this. And I just fell in love with this album. Nobody writes riffs like Noel Gallagher. He's not the greatest guitar player ever. He's not the greatest songwriter ever, but nobody else can do just right. And they're not complicated riffs. He's not playing a lot of fancy stuff here on this. And there's just something about that. And then you take Liam Gallagher's vocals and the attitude and the sneering British snottiness that he has, and you throw all that attitude on top of it, and I was just blown away by it. At that time, there really wasn't much that sounded like Oasis that was getting through to me in tiny little rural Northwest Ohio. And so this sort of became a clout thing for me then, like tell my friends, oh yeah, I'm into this British band Oasis that you've never heard of, like I was sniffing my own farts on that one, like I
It
just
was
thought
such a great feeling.
it really was. Like I just had this thing that nobody else knew about, and I turned on a couple friends to them and who went out and bought the album and and really liked it as well. So this is Oasis is way up there for me on my all-time favorite bands list. This is the one that made me discover them, fall in love with them. Very important album to me. So this was number 2 on my big board. So
Well, I told you that my next pick would absolutely not be on your board. This is another example of recency bias on my part because I did a deep dive and I teleported straight back to the time period 94, 95 and remembered how important this record was to me in that moment. And I picked Blues Traveler 4 as my number 4, which I mean, I didn't plan that.
yeah.
I didn't know it was going to hit at number 4, but this record I bought because I was kind of like this was the time period where I had a summer job and I started kind of buying a lot more records and I was really hitting the used record stores. My sister was off in college, and so I was kind of getting fed some of the more collegey type alternative rock bands. And Blues Traveler had been big in college rock with their first couple records. And so by the time they hit on alternative radio, they were kind of like the old men on the block. Um, and so it was such a shock when Runaround went crazy and then Hook went crazy. But I think I talked about this in our last episode. You know, The Mountains Win Again, Run Around, or not Run Around, Look Around, and songs like that. And then over the years, this band really kind of cemented itself in my life and kind of, for all the people who sold their copies to the used record stores, I just kept, feeling better and better and better about being a fan of this record. Their version of Imagine, if you've never heard their version of Imagine from the tribute record to John Lennon, you gotta hear it. John Popper is maybe one of the most underrated vocalist singers in all of this whole era. He sings with such power and such soul. And so, Run Around is a fun, happy, kind of throwaway pop song. But for every one of those, there's one that, and for every kind of blues, paint by numbers blues song, no matter how good the harmonica solo is, there's something with like soul and heart that just pulls your heart right out of your chest. And that is exactly what I'm looking for when I listen to music. I love it so much.
Nice. I never owned this album. This is one I just
So
never got
you're the
around to
one.
owning it. Well, I couldn't have sold it because I didn't own it. So, but I had like I almost didn't have to buy it because all my friends had it and I'd hear it like hanging out with them. So I definitely heard this album many times in my life, but it was just one that's just funny enough that I never got around to buying. Um,
This one was a fun one for me because I knew there was no chance you'd ever pick it.
yeah, it wasn't on my big board, but I certainly can appreciate it. And yeah, so I am up next here. This is my 4th pick, number 8 overall, and I'll just go with it since I already talked about it. It's Toadies Rubberneck. Um, they when we did a episode, one of our, maybe it might have even been like our 2nd or 3rd episode, where we did what bands sort of held the belt or took the belt as our favorite bands away from Pearl Jam. And I don't remember if Toadies like was definitively one or if it was an honorable mention one, but there was a time in my life after Rubberneck came out when I had this. I listened to it. So I don't know when it came out actually. I know I was listening to Possum Kingdom on the radio, like trying to figure out what this song was. I didn't know who sang it for the longest time, but I know that was in the summer because I remember like playing basketball in my driveway, listening to the radio, and anytime this would come on, I would hope the DJ would say who it was. But I remember I got it in the fall, and I ran cross country in the fall, and I was listening to that on the way to every cross country meet. I would listen to it on the way back from those cross country meets. I was just listening to it all the time. I was not listening to it while running because I didn't have a good CD player that you could run with. You know how they made those ones that had like the super like
30-second skip protection.
Yeah, I didn't have one of those, so I could never run with it. But
I had that yellow Sony one with the 30 seconds
I
anti-skip
remember
protection.
exactly what that looked like. But I had a tape player that I would run with, and I still had some cassettes. Like I had like a couple Pearl Jam albums, Temple of the Dog, Soundgarden. But
did you
anyways,
make mixtapes on like the old Memorexes?
Oh yeah,
oh yeah,
oh yeah. I've got a couple of them in a box here that I still have. I would also like record off the radio. So what I would do is when I was listening to the radio, I would have a blank tape with record and then hit pause. And then as soon as the song came on that I liked, I'd quickly unpause, record that song, and then hit pause again. So I had all these collections of songs I would get off the radio too. So what a time.
So you were a music thief way back in the day.
That's how we would steal music back then. But yeah, so Toadies, this album.
Was that actually against the law? I don't even know.
I don't think so, but I don't know. Maybe if you sold it, maybe, but
yeah.
This album, Rubberneck, I bought it because of Possum Kingdom, but there's not a song on this album that I don't absolutely love. There was not anything remotely skippable on it for me. I just fell in love with this album completely. They had a couple, Tyler, I Come From the Water. Like they had some like songs that got some radio play on it beside Possum Kingdom, but they kind of disappeared for a long time after this. It took them a long time to put out their next album, Hell Below, Stars Above. I was in college by the time that came out. And so they kind of fell out of everybody's consciousness, but they actually still are kicking around. They still play live shows. I've seen them live. It was awesome. So for me, because this is one I know hardly anybody else would put in there, but we're doing the personal list. And so for me, it just wouldn't be right to not have this album because it's such an important album in my life.
Yeah, this absolutely was not on my list. Never would have picked it. For me, Toadies were the one-hit wonder. And I know that that's not fair. I know it's not necessarily true for everybody.
Yeah.
But for me, they were nothing more than a one-hit wonder. All right. Man, last pick, because we're only doing top 5. We're going to talk about lots and lots of more records after this. But this is really hard to leave so many great things on the table. But if I'm being intellectually honest, and I'm picking the record that I listen to the most in the moment and probably endures if I was on a desert island and I had to live with my 5 record list from 1994, I almost want to start making fun of myself. But I'm going to pick Dave Matthews Band, Under the Table and Dreaming.
Interesting.
So
this is a bit of a surprise pick for me.
Thank you. So 95... In February of 95, I turned 16 years old and I start driving. And part of driving meant driving other people around and listening to records that were palatable to people other than myself.
Yep.
And not everybody wanted to listen to the Downward Spiral all the time, even though I wanted to listen to, nothing about songs that reference pigs and have metal riffs and whatnot.
Yeah.
You had to listen to these kinds of things that maybe females would enjoy. And so I listened to so much Dave Matthews Band, Under the Table and Dreaming. I knew every word. I like to sing along with it. I drove around singing that record to an unbelievable degree. So that one, it had so many hits on it. It was in the moment. Dave Matthews Band, now they're about to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but in the moment, it was like, why is this college band so popular? Like, how did this happen? What was your memory of that band and this record in that moment?
So I couldn't drive yet, so I was still occasionally taking the bus. And I remember they would...
By the way, not 94, February 95. So shortly after,
Okay, I got anyway. You. But
this came out in September of 94. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
Well, I just remember riding on the bus and them playing. What was the first single off of this?
What Would You Say?
What Would You Say? And I remember... so we would get Toledo radio stations, and the bus would always have 92.5, which was like a pop station, but they would play this song. And I always really liked it because it was like, I didn't like a lot of the pop stuff that they were playing. So like, but this had like guitars in it. And there was something like just interesting about it and catchy. But I kind of had the same feeling as you. Like, as they became more and more popular, it sort of felt like, and we can look back at it now, but it might have been the first sign really of people being tired of the grunge, the angst, the dark imagery, the depressive lyrics. I think this was more lighthearted and fun. And people were just like, oh, yeah, that's right. Like, you can have rock music that is still can be more, a little bit more lighthearted. Now, not all Dave Matthews Band songs are lighthearted by any means, but
No.
there was just, that sound was just in such stark contrast to the Seattle sound that had pervaded music for 4 years, that I just think this was like one of the first signs that that was about to shift. But funny enough, like, I also have a memory of this album connected to a driving memory. And so I would hear that song on the bus, but then every once in a while, a girl in my class would give me rides home from school. And so, because she was one of the first ones to have her license out of our class. And she always had like a mixtape of stuff, and she had Satellite on it. And that was like her one of her absolute favorite songs. And that's just like always stuck with me. Like, when I got my guitar, that was like one of the first like trickier little guitar parts that I tried to learn, and I thought I was so cool when I could fumble my way through that intro. So I also have a memory related to driving with it.
So, and the other thing that, and this relates to me having an older sister who is away at college and kind of giving me ideas of what to listen to, and me actually enjoying it, because when she was still in high school, you know, this is the kind of the generational divide between somebody who graduated from high school in 94 versus somebody who graduated in 97 like myself, because she and her friends were going to see Steve Miller Band and Jimmy Buffett at Blossom, all the party music, right?
Yeah.
And then we kind of grew up on the grunge and the self-serious music, the less party music.
Yeah.
And so when I heard Dave Matthews Band, it was the perfect mix of party college music, but also serious, kind of angsty, little bit of emotion.
Yeah.
But because it was given to me by my older sister who was away at college, I don't know if I was the absolute first one in my high school to be listening to Dave Matthews Band, but I was darn close.
I personally feel this could be revisionist history, but I feel like it was really Crash that made it cool for people our age to listen to Dave Matthews Band. Like, I don't feel like,
I think so too.
As much as today I can listen to Under the Table and Dreaming, and I can really enjoy it, but I think they didn't become quote unquote cool for people our age to listen to until Crash. Crash really made it. And again, but we were also a little bit older then. I was in college when Crash came out, and so maybe that's part of it too. But I think that it's just really interesting to think about their place in all of this. And I think that's what's cool. I mean, we keep harping on this, but again, like all these different bands with all these different sounds and styles, and 94 was just such a great year for such a wide array of music.
And by the way, while I was talking about this one, it made me think about another record that's not on our big board that came out the same time. It wouldn't have made my top 5 anyway, and it's not going to make yours. But Rusted Root, when Rusted Root was exactly in that same category of, are they college, are they alternative, and then they break out with Send Me On My Way, and they become this giant alternative radio band after just like barely surviving in tiny rooms in the college circuit around the Midwest.
Well, yeah, then they played every college camp. Like, I'm pretty sure every year I was at Ohio State, Rusted Root played on campus. Like, it just feels that way to me. So yeah, for sure.
All right,
All
Last but not
right.
least, Andrew,
Last but not
round
least,
out your
so
top five.
there's so many ones I wish I could put on here. There's a couple albums.
Can I make a prediction?
Yeah, you can make the prediction.
All right. So now that you're down to your last pick, I know you're not going to pick Bush 16 Stone.
No,
I know that you're not going to pick Hootie and the Blowfish, Cracked Review.
not so much.
There's like a 5% chance that you would pick Hole, Live Through This.
That is definitely in consideration.
But I think the personal Andrew pick, knowing what I know about you personally, I think it's going to be Monster by REM.
See, okay, so that's a great pick. It's not going to be REM.
No!
There was...
Do you like my logic at least?
I do. I very much do.
Okay.
So there are, let's see, I'm looking at my list here. I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 albums that I would say are all
Just list
bunched
them
up here. I'm going to list the ones that I'm not picking.
No, list them all, because I don't know which one you're going to pick. So list them all.
Okay. Well, I kind of already hinted that it's not going to be Hole, Live Through This. Rollins Band, Wait. Green Day, Dookie. Weezer, Blue Album. Pantera, Far Beyond Driven. REM, Monster.
It's going to be Dookie.
It's Dookie. Yep. You're
All
absolutely right. So I have to pick Dookie because, again, being honest, like, such an important album. Again, like, you know, for me, Green Day is a seminal punk band. Now, I know that punk existed well before them. I'm well aware of it. I have since gone back.
What are you, some kind of a poser,
discovered
Andrew?
all that. But, you know, yeah, I was, again, I was a teenager.
We all were posers.
Yeah, I was a teenager living in rural Northwest Ohio. We just didn't get a lot of cool music coming through. And Green Day just awoken something within me, and which I later realized was my love for punk music. And Dookie was, God, what an album. It was blisteringly short. Like, this was an era when albums were all like 50 minutes long, and Dookie clocks in at like 30 something minutes, 32 minutes, maybe, something like that. But I mean, today I can still put that on and just belt out every single lyric. I know every lyric by heart of this. Like,
all right, if you include the hidden track, it comes out at 39:35.
Okay, so that was just.
But I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah, but I mean, but at that time, like, that, even 39 minutes was a fast album at that time. Like, it was unheard of for an album to be under 40 minutes. You know, it was like, you got all that space on the CD, you got to use it up, right? But you know that.
All right, hang on one second. You got Longview, Welcome to Paradise, Basket Case, She, When I Come Around. Those are just the singles.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember the first time hearing Basket Case, and that intro part literally made the hair on my arm stand up. That I had never heard anything like that. And so, yeah, so like, it just, they inspired me. Like, I was like, I was certainly aware of the fact, like, you know, Pearl Jam talked about punk music a lot. Kurt Cobain was always talking about punk music. So, like, I knew punk music existed, but, like, I was familiar with the Ramones, you know, the Clash. You know, I didn't even think of them as a punk band because, you know, I just knew, like, should I stay or should I go? Probably, you know, I'm trying to think, like, you know, Bad Religion was around. Like, I'm just trying to think of, like, the bigger punk bands that would have even made their way to the record store in my town. But there wasn't many options. But it was Green Day that really inspired me to, like, really go into deep dives into punk music and discovering more of that world. So I know we talked about this in another episode, but, you know, I'm sensitive when people rip on Green Day and say they're not a punk band. I think that's absolute nonsense.
It's gatekeeping garbage.
Yep. You know, you can say whatever you want about what Green Day became later.
If you want to
career.
pretend you were in SoCal in those days and that you were the one at the punk club, unless you were like 75 people in the world who are still alive, you don't get to call Green Day a poser band. You
Yeah.
just don't.
Yeah. So excuse me, I didn't make my way over to Gilman Street to check out Green Day in 1992 or
Some of us
whatever.
were born in Ohio.
Yeah. So it's just I you know I don't care for Green Day's music today. Like their newer music doesn't do anything for me. I would really say post American Idiot. I've just really fallen out with them. But it's just their first. Well, it's not their first, but Counting Dookie is the first album I heard. Uh, you know, Dookie, Nimrod, even Warning I liked a lot. That it was just such an important band to me, and so like I just cannot help but look back with so much nostalgia and fondness for Dookie that if I'm just being honest, this has to be in my top 5. So
All right. I dig it. I should have known, that's a number one pick for the majority of the universal lists. Dookie is just a really important record.
yeah,
I've never been a big Green Day fan. I like their top 5 or top 7, top 8 songs. I've just never been that big of a fan. But when they played a festival that I was at a few years ago, I was in heaven. I absolutely loved it. I thought they were great. But if they had been the only band, I probably wouldn't have gone to see them.
they're a perfect
It's just
festival
so,
band, by the way. Like I don't
yeah.
I've seen them headlining, and like I don't actually love them as a arena headlining band, but
But you get them in like 80-minute set.
yes, then it's perfect. So
By the way, I would say the same thing about Red Hot Chili Peppers today. Like, you don't really want to see 2.5 hours of Red Hot Chili Peppers,
no,
but 80
yeah,
minutes, they're a perfect
I can do
band.
that. Sure.
Um, so let another perfect festival band, one that you and I need to talk about before we end this podcast, the Blue Album by Weezer.
Yep.
I have accidentally seen Weezer 4 times now. I like Weezer. I wouldn't have gone out of my way to see them as the headliner, but they've played at 4 different festival dates that I've been to, and I've enjoyed the hell out of it. They're really great today. They play just the right number of covers. They play all the hits. They don't mess around.
Yeah.
They're not very precious about their themselves or their catalog. I love them more probably than I should, but they're not a vital band for me.
I would agree with all of that. However, they were on a trajectory to be so much more than that. For me, we talked about how despite the fact that the universe decided Pinkerton sucked, I loved it when it came out, and so for me, like having the Blue Album and Pinkerton, like I was like, this is like such a great band, and they, the Green Album I liked. Red Album has some stuff I like. I enjoyed the White Album. Everything Will Be Okay in the End. I loved that album. But like for the most part, like most Weezer albums just come and go for me at this point. But I think it's important to talk about the Blue Album because again, we talk about the stark contrast between what was going on in music at that time. To go from Closer by 9 Inch Nails and then Buddy Holly, like play those songs back to back. You could not have 2 more different songs in vibe and imagery. 9 Inch Nails go with all the darkness. Soundgarden, Super Unknown was such a dark album.
Limo Wreck.
Yeah, and then you have this bright blue album cover. These 4 guys on the cover. Buddy Holly, like the Undone, the Sweater Song was like that one was kind of moody and atmospheric in ways, like so that kind of made sense as in that era. But
And this is about me, but without Say It Ain't So, I probably don't even care about Weezer at all to this day.
yeah, Say It Ain't So
That's
is
the one for
just
me.
incredible. I just bought the Blue Album on vinyl last weekend, so it's a new one in my collection. That just shows how important that is. That I wanted to get that added to my collections. So I've listened to it I think 3 times already since I had it. Like it's
So
it's a
there's
good album.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's it.
People
I
hate
was
when we
I
talk.
was winding down.
people hate when we talk over each other, so I try really
Yeah.
hard not to do it.
Yeah.
Um, Technology is so great today, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
I want your, and again, I did a record, Jar of Flies, where I gave you the lead. I want to prod you with another one. I want to talk about Monster by REM. You're a much bigger REM fan than I am. However, I will say that the song that brought me into Monster was What's the Frequency, Kenneth. But in the end,
Strange
Strange
Currencies.
Currencies might be my favorite REM song of all time.
Yeah, that's a
I could start crying talking
oh,
about
dude,
that
it's
one.
so good. It's funny because when Monster came out, like suddenly they were sort of getting grouped. Like people said it was their grunge album, which I don't
Well, because the
really.
guitar sound on Kenneth was kind of like,
Oh,
oh, are they got a
and
pedal?
Bang and
Ooh,
Blame was kind of a aggressive
yeah.
song for REM, but you know, I don't know, like Out of
First of all,
Time.
give everybody kind of a history of your fandom of REM, because you're a way bigger REM fan than I am, and I like them, but you're a big fan.
Yeah, so I fell in love with them with Losing My Religion. And I, again, we talk about things that didn't really fit anything else that was going on at that time, but for some reason that song just resonated with me. And it still does to this day. I love the mandolin part in that song so much. And again, you want to talk about harmonies and the soaring chorus of that song. I mean, it just got me. So I went out and got Out of Time. Um, I didn't necessarily love that album at that time. I think I just wasn't ready to appreciate what that was. I would compare that a little bit to like Counting Crows, August and Everything After. Like when I first heard that, I wasn't quite ready, I think, for that. And I appreciate that album so much more today than I did when I bought that tape, because I bought that tape because of Mr. Jones. So it's a very similar experience. Like I bought this because of Losing My Religion, and nothing else sounds like that on Out of Time. So I was kind of disappointed, and just like nothing else sounds like Mr. Jones on August and Everything After. But like both of those things I've come to appreciate since. But that run, so, and mind you, I'm speaking from my experience. If you're older than me or if you're cooler than me, you might have been into REM's college rock era. And
My first experience with REM was the song "Stand" from the opening of the TV show Get a Life, starring Chris Elliott.
yeah, yeah. So there's
So,
certainly.
but that's very different than somebody who was in college in the
Yeah,
'80s.
so I'm not sitting here trying to say like that REM didn't do anything good or important before then. I'm only talking about
No,
my experience. But then Automatic for the People just was this mind-blowing album for me, and it just vaulted them in there, where in this era of listening to all these heavy grunge bands, that was sort of when I wanted something that was a little bit of a different vibe or a different pace. REM was where I turned. And so when Monster came out, it definitely is a shift in sound for them. Like there's all kinds of like weird sort of like, whereas previously I would almost describe their guitar sound as jangly. Starting with Monster, they really laid into some of the more shoegazy guitar sound. They were using a lot of delay effects and just creating like these textures that were different for them. And so that's kind of where I came from with that. And then like when New Adventures in Hi-Fi came out, like that's my favorite REM album. That's a absolute elite album for me. And that's so I have since gone back and I've listened to all their early stuff. I've stayed with them to the end. I still say Collapse Into Now, their last album, is one of my favorite REM albums. But yeah, in that time though, like you know, we kind of knew that Kurt was friends with Michael Stipe. You had kind of that was just in articles you would read, and it just kind of created this connection there between the two. And I don't know, like there was like Monster was just this way that made REM sort of cool to a lot of people our age, that I don't think they were like, because as much as I liked Losing My Religion, a lot of my friends hated that. Like that they all thought REM was lame. And
Well, it was certainly the most overplayed video on MTV because the video was so good that
yeah,
overexposure was so prevalent in the era that you and I came up as music fans, and so many of our listeners and people who watch on YouTube, you guys know what it was to be overexposed.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, so that's definitely an important one for me to talk about. And I've been talking a lot, so I'll let you, if there's any other ones you want to talk about. I do have another one I just kind of want to say a couple words
All right,
about.
another one that's a little bit goofy, and I might have already talked about this on the podcast, but another one that I played because girls liked it. And so I turned 16 and I never had any romantic ideas about the cute girls who lived in my neighborhood, but I was the first one to turn 16 in my neighborhood, so I drove them all to school, and I had the best time with these friends of mine. They were all friends.
Mm-hmm.
But I played Aerosmith's Big
Oh
Ones
man, what an
so
album!
many times because that was the record. It had Walk on Water. It had Love in an Elevator, Ragdoll, What It Takes, Dude Looks Like a Lady, Janie's Got a Gun, Crying, Amazing. The the Crying and Amazing were these ginormous hits from
Mm-hmm.
Get a Grip. Deuces Are Wild was from the Beavis and Butthead Experience.
Such a
That's
good
a
song, so
phenomenal
good.
song. And then Crazy, Eat the Rich, Angel might be my favorite Aerosmith song, and then Living on the Edge. It does not have the song which came later from the Asteroid movie soundtrack,
Right.
but what a killer disc! And just a if you wanted to play something in your '88 Plymouth Sundance on the way to school that was had universal appeal, that was the record. And that's what I remember of that record. I saw them live on that stadium tour, and it was just so great.
I can still appreciate and go back and listen to Permanent Vacation, Pump, and Get a Grip. Not as I don't like that one quite as much as the other two.
But why bother when you got Big
I
Ones?
was say to me, like Big Ones is like if you just want the era when Joe Perry came back to Aerosmith, like this covers it. Like this can be a
Yeah,
definitive
if you
way.
create a playlist of Big Ones plus Dream On, you're just there.
Yeah, and so yeah, that it's just a ridiculously good greatest quote unquote greatest hit. It's like not truly a greatest hits because it's just more of an era, but greatest hits of that era of Aerosmith. But that's when the Aerosmith to me was really at their peak.
So the only question is, do you remember when Aerosmith did Dream On in 1991 on the MTV Movie Awards with Michael Kamen and an orchestra?
I don't think so.
Because that version, where they're older and they're grown up and they're in their Get a Grip era,
Mm-hmm.
is 91. Is that the Get a Grip era,
Yeah,
or is that the Pump era?
no, let's Get a Grip. Well, maybe it was
That
92.
version,
I don't know, but it's right around there.
but that version from 91 is the version of Dream On for me. I remember recording it off the TV. I remember having it and recording it to a tape. But I wonder if it's even on Spotify. I'll look while you're talking.
So I'll talk about one other I want to mention. Man, I wish I could talk about all of these. I do want to. I mentioned it briefly in when I was listing the group of albums, but Rollins band, Wait. And the reason I want to talk about this is because Henry Rollins.
Let me interrupt for 1 second because I also want to talk about this one desperately.
Oh, okay.
So go ahead.
Perfect. So I had no clue who Henry Rollins was. You know, I talked about Black Flag was not a thing that crossed my radar.
You're telling my story. Go ahead.
Okay. But anyways, so Liar comes out and just this amazing song, just mind blowing. Again, so I didn't even understand what genre it was, and the ferocity with which Henry performs on that song. I absolutely fell in love with that album. I think it was probably closer to 95 by the time I was listening to Wait. I don't think it was probably 94 already, but anyways, I just remember falling in love with it. And then from there, you kind of do the deep dive and you figure out like, wait, Henry Rollins is like this legendary like figure in this punk underground. And I have Henry Rollins is a absolute personal hero of mine. I have a lot of his books. I have posters hanging on in my office. I have a poster of him from the Recountdown tour. I've seen him on spoken word tours like 3 times, I think. I, I completely identify with his outlook on life. A lot of his ethos have just had a huge impact on my life. And so I feel like I have to talk about this album. It probably in that moment didn't rate with some of these other ones that I talked about, but like it's just my introduction to Henry Rollins had such a profound impact on my life, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this.
So this was one of those records that I bought because of Liar, and then I I couldn't tell you any of the other names of the other songs, but I listened to this record front to back over and over and over to the point where Liar was just kind of like,
Yeah,
oh, the radio hit.
absolutely.
Um, but this sounded nothing like anything else that was being played at the time. I knew that it carried some extra gravity because of the career that Henry Rollins had had prior, but I I to this day I couldn't name a single song by Black Flag. I never went back. I never listened to Black Flag. My Henry Rollins experience is his spoken word, his books, and this record. And that's just the nature of being born in 1979, I think. But I just this was one of those records that, because we grew up in the era that we grew up and that you and I both happened to buy it, that we were committed to loving it because we owned it and
Yeah,
we were pot committed.
yeah. The funny thing, I guess, about I pretty positive that Henry only played on one Black Flag album. I think or did he do? He might have done two, but for sure, Damaged is the one that everybody knows. But like, he had such a outsized impact on the legacy of that band. I think the fans always identify Henry as like this singular force of Black Flag. I mean, outside of Greg Ginn, like obviously Greg Ginn is Black Flag, but I I don't know, like it's just funny to think about this fact that like there was this whole subculture that viewed him one way, and I knew nothing about that, and I just fell in love with Liar because of that performance, and like without even understanding what that meant or what that was. And yeah, so just I'm with you. I now view Wait the same way. Like Liar is almost an afterthought on that album. Like there's so many better songs on that album, but yeah, like that was just such a huge impact on my life.
All right, I got one last record that I feel like I really want to talk about, and there's a reason why it didn't make my top five, and that's Dinosaur Jr. Without a
That was
Sound.
on my
Um,
big board.
I love this record. It's absolutely in my top 10 from 94. The reason why I probably left it out of my top five is that it's not the number one Dinosaur Jr. record for me. It's not the one I go to first. It has their biggest hit, um, but it's not. And I know they still play that song essentially every time they play live. But Lou Barlow doesn't play on it on the record. It's like Jay Mascis and a backing band.
Was there anything cooler though? Like nothing made me happier on the radio when you heard that bottle pop sound and you knew that song was coming.
Yeah, because Feel the Pain is
I always
coming
want to say
next.
bring the pain, feel the pain.
Yeah. So what I mean, what are your memories of that one?
I remember the video. The video was just the coolest freaking thing. Them playing golf in
And for anybody who doesn't remember, they were golfing, they were in a golf cart,
driving
they
through New
were
York
all
City.
that kind of
Like,
stuff.
yeah, it wasn't on a golf course. It was going through New York City playing like urban golf. Yeah, that was I
By the way, the personnel from this record: Jay Mascis, drums, guitar, keyboards, vocals; Mike Johnson bass vocals.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm much like you. Like this was my introduction to Dinosaur Jr. I don't know the last time I actually listened to that album. Like I'm trying to think. Like
Oh, I listened to it a lot.
I really
But my
don't.
introduction was Where You Been. I was the only person in my friend group who listened to Where You Been.
Yeah.
That was because I saw one out there on or Start Shopping on 120 Minutes, I
Oh
think, or maybe
yeah.
it was out there.
God, 120 minutes was such a great way to discover music back in the day.
That's how I discovered Creep by Radiohead.
Yeah. Since we're winding down, I'm just going to name
Yeah.
the other albums in my top 20 that I
All right,
haven't even
let's do it.
mentioned. I'm not going to talk about them. I'll just mention them. Corrosion of Conformity, Deliverance, which could have been in my top 5. Hole, Live Through This. Oh, wait. Well, I guess we did mention that one. Mark Lanigan, Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. Our Lady Peace, Naveed. Korn, self-titled. Offspring, Smash. Rancid, Let's Go, and Collective Soul.
I'm a notorious Offspring hater, by the way.
So am I, but I loved Smash. Collective Soul, Hints, Allegations, and Things Left Unsaid.
It kills me. It absolutely kills me not to have No Need to Argue by Cranberries.
Yeah, that was
just this was a record that I bought for Zombie because I heard it on the radio, and then this gave me an appreciation for Cranberries, the Cranberries. Is it Cranberries or the Cranberries?
I can never remember. I think it's Cranberries, but I'm not positive.
But it gave me an appreciation for them that I just didn't totally get from their first record. But it made me go back. I went to the used record store and I bought their first record, and it caused me to just fall in love with Dolores as a vocalist, the whole band. And it was another one that I owned, so I committed to it.
Yeah.
And I listened to that record a lot.
I remember
it really impacted me.
Yeah, sorry. Now it's my turn to talk over you, but I remember
It's all good.
like being in disbelief that Linger and Zombie was the same band, that they could write those two songs. Like that's unbelievable. And they had another one. What was the like really slow? Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. They had another song that was a totally different style that was like really slow. There was another one that like all the girls in my class liked, but I'm
Dreams.
Yep. And so like just
Great song.
Crazy that they can write such different styles of songs is unbelievable.
Yeah. And of course, we didn't talk about Hootie and the Blowfish, gigantic band. We didn't talk about Live, Throwing Copper. I've turned on that one. I loved it in the moment.
Yeah.
I hate that record today. That's a me thing. I'm not judging you if you still like it. And by the way, White Discussion, I still think is a great song. I find the preciousness of that band just to be too much. I can't deal with it. You and I talked about Bush, 16 Stone. That record is somewhat undeniable, whether you like it or not. And I kind of agree with you. Like, I find it cute and fun. You don't.
I hate it.
but it's for me, it's like bubblegum and sugar.
Yeah.
So I'm not here to defend it as an artistic work.
Yeah.
Another one that like totally doesn't fit into the vibe, but I think is really important and maybe underrated is The Division Bell by Pink Floyd. There was a huge contingent of fans of Pink Floyd in my high school who loved that record. I think that record is great.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make my list, my top 5, but it absolutely belongs on the board and in the conversation. Any last thoughts, Andrew? Any last thoughts? Like, here's another one that I need you to talk about because I can't. Ill Communication by Beastie Boys.
Yeah, I mean, that one was huge. I mean, obviously, Sabotage was just this massive song that, again, sort of...
Does it feel weird to leave it off?
It probably not for me because this is not my favorite Beastie Boys album, really. But I like... But what does feel weird is to not like have Sabotage part of that conversation. Because if you were making songs that defined 1994, you have
To this day,
to talk about
timeless.
Sabotage. But just for me, because we're doing it as a personal list, it's not going to go there. But probably if we were doing one for like the most popular that people liked, you would probably almost have to include this, because this album was absolutely massive amongst a lot of people our age.
All right. Well, I appreciate all your contributions on this one, man. I appreciate you agreeing to just leave Vitalogy out, because I think it was a more interesting episode with us taking Vitalogy off the top.
Yeah.
Man, this one was really fun. I enjoyed this one a lot.
Yeah, it was. It's kind of interesting, like looking back at our top 10. Like, I'm not sure if you told people like list the top 10 albums of 1994 that they would match up very closely to ours. But like when you look at Nine Inch Nails, Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, so far like we're pretty on par there. But then our bottom half going Oasis, Blues Traveler, Toadies, Dave Matthews Band, Green Day, like kind of goes. But that just speaks to what 1994 was. You know, it was this dichotomy of really great, important 90s albums, like the grunge sound, but also this beginning of this divergence into a plethora of different sounds, textures, genres that came out in 94. So it's just such a great year.
And we didn't even mention Mellow Gold by Beck.
Yeah.
What a wild ass year.
Yep. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. Like I said, I started with 51 albums. Like, and there are things that I even cut off of that some people.
And you forgot Rusted Root.
Well, yeah, that probably still wouldn't make my cut. They're not for me, but there's no question they had their moment after 94.
Cruel Sun is a badass song to this day. But yeah, no. All right. As always, we're not right. This is just our take. These are our picks.
Yeah.
Give us your top 5, man. Put it on your YouTube comments. Give it to us on Twitter, on Facebook. We're all over the place. We'd love to see what you guys think we missed, or what it is for you. Thanks so much for listening and watching. We've got a huge contingent of people who are watching us on YouTube. We thank you for that. The whole like and subscribe. And we'll talk to you next time. It's been the Album of Record podcast.